So this work was done with Anind, Chun, and then our co-advised student, Orson Xu, who unfortunately couldn't be here because of a visa issue. So he's going to talk a little bit via a recorded video about some of what we did, and then I'm going to give the rest of the talk just because we wanted to make sure he still had a chance to be up on the screen. And that's him right there. So we'll see how this goes in terms of the audio quality.
Our topic is clenching traction, not a biting input technique.
No, okay. One sec. I was worried about that. I will do this instead. Good. Well, so in actuality, I think I could probably skip this slide because we just saw such a wonderful motivation for why bite interaction is something we might want to consider. But I do want to just sort of touch on some of the previous work that's been done in this realm. So what you see here are some examples of tongue and jaw-based input. So in particular, on the left is a joystick that you can control with your tongue. Here we can detect whether the user is applying pressure to their cheek using the tongue. And in this example, again, it's measuring the changes in the shape of the face caused by the tongue touching it from the inside. So that's one set of examples of how people have done interaction in and around the jaw. And then the other thing that has been most commonly shown in the literature is tooth click related interaction. So what we're seeing here, for example, is an in-ear bone conduction microphone that's being used to detect tooth click sounds. And here is a confirmation technique that's using tooth click in conjunction with eye gaze. And then this is some work by Dan Ashbrook and others that was also looking at which tooth was being clicked, so the 5 different pairs of teeth were supported. So these are just some examples of some of the sensors that have been used for this in the past. Now, in our work, what we're actually using is the clenching motion of the jaw, so specifically pressure, rather than tooth clicking, and also looking at different regions of the mouth that you could clench with. And the main goal of this paper is really to explore the design space for clench-based interaction. So in particular, in our work, we were interested in force and specifically how many different levels of force can somebody effectively control, as well as what kinds of interactions make sense in terms of repetitions, like double clicking with your teeth, or more sustained interactions like clenching and holding. And then finally, we looked at asymmetric, meaning left versus right, and symmetric, meaning clenching with the entire jaw as aspects of the design space. And in order to explore all of this, we did a series of studies, and I'm going to talk about some of them in slightly more depth and some in less. So we'll start with the first study, which was just a basic target acquisition task that was really meant to be both a proof of concept and to give us basic parameters for how to best signal the end of an interaction, as well as what levels of force somebody could easily control. And just to give you a picture of the sensor that we built, unfortunately it was not wireless, but what we did was we encased a force sensor in layers of material that would allow for in-mouth use, and the whole thing is about 1.5 millimeters thick to keep its the sort of interference with just regular jaw use to a minimum. So that's the sensor we designed, although I will say that this, again, the sensor was intended to prove that this was a useful approach and not necessarily to be the final way that you would do this. Okay, so this is an example of the interface we used in the first study, so really a pure target acquisition task, and in this case the user has to select from among 3 different levels. We had 4 different conditions in terms of the levels of force that the user needed to control, so here's the same example with 8 different levels. And in these examples what you're seeing is what we call quick release, which is to say that when the user achieves the level that they were aiming for, they just let the force go down to 0 by opening their mouth. We also explored other techniques for how to indicate the end of selection. So, for example, the dwell technique involves staying in the region for a full second. And we also, I'm not going to talk about it today, but you can look in the paper, we did a version where a keyboard key was used, what we called button, in order to end the selection. And then we also explored two different forms of visual feedback. So the first is full feedback, and you can see it here on the left. And in the partial feedback case, what really we were trying to aim at was to get a sense of how well this would work as an eyes-free display, but because it was a study and we needed to indicate the target, we do show a little bit of information to the user, not where their cursor is, just where they're aiming and when they get there at the end. So that was the design for the first study that we did. And just to talk about some of the results, the first thing we saw was that in the case of dwell selection, there is a real impact of the number of levels on speed. And I'll explain this in a second when we get to error. This is speeds without the 1 second dwell time, just to give you a sense of how high these are. And the y-axis there is seconds. And then the x-axis is just showing the different levels that needed to be distinguished. When we switch to quick release, this effect gets to be much smaller. It's still there, but the impact of the number of levels on speed is not as significant. We also found that quick release was more accurate. So what you're seeing here on the y-axis is how many times the user exited the region once they had entered it that was needed for selection. So you can see that in the case of dwell, especially with 8 different levels, it was really hard to keep the target selected for the length of time necessary to complete the dwell selection. And we believe that is a strong explanation for why we saw such differences in the target selection time in the dwell case. Whereas with the quick release, on average, they had less than 1 error per selection task. So that's just a more reliable method for doing things. We also found that the visual feedback doesn't have a really big impact on time, which is a good signal that a heads-up variant of this might be a reliable option for people. And that's true even when we have 8 different levels, which is really encouraging in terms of the fidelity with which someone could use this. So that was the sort of baseline study that we needed in order to launch a more deeper investigation into what are the kinds of interaction techniques that somebody might want. And by the way, the ends over here is just indicating how many users participated in each of these studies. So this second study, we wanted to scale up and get input from a lot of people about interaction techniques, and we actually looked at 24 different techniques. I will refer you to the paper for the details on that, but they involve variations on not only the force levels that you see in the first study, but also whether an interaction would involve a single press, a double press, a hold and release kind of thing. So we looked at time and then also symmetry. And the way that we executed this study was we just asked people to pretend they had a sensor in their mouth, try each of the things out, and then just rate it on preference. So this was just purely trying to help us narrow down the field in order to do the final studies that let us explore in more depth how this worked. So here you can see that when people experimented with different levels of force, they had a preference for light. And so, anything above like 3.5 here is a positive rating. So all of these were okay, but light on the bottom there was the most positive on a 7-point Likert scale. And we asked about other things too, but I'm just going to talk about preference today. When we add in single, double, and triple clenches with the jaw, we see that people found it more comfortable to do a single in their sort of experimental simulation than double, and more comfortable to do double than triple. Now, this was for symmetric actions. The results for asymmetric actions, meaning left versus right, are very similar in terms of what is best, but you can see that there's a slight reduction in preference when they're doing it only on one side. And when we look at sustained clench, we had similar results, except that symmetric and asymmetric were a little bit closer together. So based on this, we selected the 6 most preferred interaction techniques, and then we started to develop applications that were a little bit less abstract in order to explore how people might make use of clenching. So the first study I'm going to talk about was in a VR setting. And here we asked each person to perform all 6 of the actions that were most preferred. in this context. And then we also compared this. So in every case, the user had a head-mounted pointer on that they could use for 2D positioning, and they could either, in one baseline, just use the head-mounted pointer with dwell for selection, and in the other baseline, we gave them a handheld button that they could press for selection. So we have those two baselines, and then in each of those three conditions, they tried all 6 interaction techniques. And I just want to show what the VR setup looked like in the case of the clench interaction. So what you see on the left and the right are feedback about how strongly they're clenching. And then those two lines there just indicate where we had the cutoff for light and heavy. And in this experiment, we only ever had 3 levels of force that we were sensing. But we played around with other aspects of the interaction techniques. And then finally, the little red dot just indicates where the head cursor is. So I'm going to show the 6 interaction techniques in video. So the first one was just a single clench, and the head mouse was used to select the move over the target, and then the clench is used to indicate selection. In the second task, they had to color the bottom square to match the top square using a force level. And so the 3 force levels map onto green, yellow, and red. So you can see here that they're just using the force level to select red in this case. And that black dot is just moving them on to the next task. Now they're going to select green with a lower force, and then we're going to have them select the yellow. In this task, we were comparing their ability to use double and single clench to indicate 2 different responses. So what they're doing here is they're looking at the equation and they're clicking once or clenching once for yes and twice for no based on whether the equation is actually correct or not. In task 4, we are using a sustained clench. And it's symmetric, meaning they don't have to differentiate one side to the other, as was everything I showed you so far. And what they're doing here is they're starting the clench to grab something. They're using the head mouse to move, and then when they release, it gets dropped. So that's a way of, moving something across the screen. Here we're starting to use asymmetric interaction. So by clenching on either the right side or the left side, they can control the direction that the blue dot is moving. And then finally in task 6, we're using a sustained asymmetric clench, and that's controlling where this dot is moving along the linear actuator here. So those are the 6 tasks we tested, and you can see that they vary in how long it takes to complete them. So these are longer completion times than for the basic target selection task, and some of these tasks are also more complicated. That's the clench case. When we add the other 2 baselines, which did not involve clench interaction, again, just the head mouse with dwell, and then also the head mouse with button click, we can see that there is not a lot of difference between these 3 conditions. So the stars do indicate where there is difference, but the effect sizes are small, even where the difference is significant. So the main result coming out of this study is that clench interaction is no worse than other options. It's also not shiningly better in our results here. And we did look at the error rate as well, and we see slightly larger differences here. In 3 cases, clench is better or equal, and in 3 cases, it's a little bit worse. Our final study, we actually had people on a stationary bike, and we had them use the clench to answer, mute, or reject a phone call, to switch to a previous or next song, and to turn down and up the volume. So we're just trying to sort of move more and more in the direction of realism here. And here we compare to standard methods for doing the same things using either earphones that had some actuation on them or just the phone itself. In this study, we see that clench is a lot faster than what was found in the other conditions. Okay, so a little bit about limitations. I was going to play a recorded video here again, so I'm going to flip through the videos because I don't have the slides up. But the thickness of the sensor, of course, is not negligible, and having a cord hanging out of your mouth is not ideal. So we really need the completion of the previous paper in order to get around all of that, although it might also be possible to explore other methods like EMG sensing. And we did double check on whether there was any medical consequences of clenching a lot, and it looks like we're okay there, but not necessarily people's preference to do clenching, especially if it's especially if it is the case that it is sustained or frequent. Just trying to pull up the second slide here. So in summary, Our goal in this paper was really to demonstrate both the feasibility of clench interaction and some of the parameters, design parameters that you might use when considering how to design such an interface. And we did find some useful facts that low force is preferred, but a range of forces are accessible to people, especially if you're using quick release to indicate selection. That the use of a sustained clench is feasible, and we sort of played around again with these different parameters of how many times you click and where you click. And I guess I will end there, thanking Orson for all his work on this project, as well as the other co-authors, and see if there are any questions. Yeah.
So we have time for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Nice work. My name is Xuhai from office in Germany. Regarding the realistic use during biking, have you also considered if accidental clenching might happen, for instance, when you're quite exhausted and just squeeze your jaws?
That's a really good question. We did not explore intent to interact, which you might think about. There's lots of reasons why you might clench that are not accidental as well, right? And so being able to distinguish when somebody intends that and when they don't is always an interesting challenge. Not something we looked at in depth. It would be interesting to see if you could develop a sense of force profiles that should be ignored, for example, or whether there's a way that you'd want to indicate start of interaction.
Okay, thank you.
That was a really nice talk, thanks. I was just wondering about the mapping function between the actual clench forces and the levels, because the levels themselves were evenly spaced, whereas I would imagine, and I could be wrong, that the force exerted wouldn't necessarily be linearly actuated. Yeah. And then the second question which follows up from that would be, what about individual differences? Did you notice the need for...
Could you speak up on the second
Did you notice the need for individual differences, to calibrate for individual differences in order to achieve accuracy?
Right. So we did do some calibration in order to determine what was the minimum and maximum force that we wanted to map the range into. I don't believe that we also used a sort of variable force profile in doing that mapping. And unfortunately, Orson really should be here to answer your question about to what degree we did individual calibration in the study. I don't believe we calibrated separately for each person. I think we were able to determine a reasonable choice that worked for everyone, but I would have to refer back to him to be positive about that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, Tomas Vega from the Media Lab. I was wondering if participants with Overbite or Underbite experience trouble performing the clench gesture.
Thanks for your question. So I should have been repeating the questions all along. The question is about an overbite versus an underbite. That was not something that we explored in our study or had an issue with.
I will ask a question also.
Sure.
Okay. So, you know, some people, when they are stressed, they clench. Have you considered to measure stress levels to calibrate according to that?
That's a really interesting, actually separate idea, I think, in terms of also how to use the system, because if you wanted to study stress, I mean, we talk about galvanic skin response and other things, but it would be fascinating, I think, to just have a passively sensing clench setup and see whether there was interesting signals in there that we don't get through other means. That's, again, not something we explored, but thank you for the idea.